We're happy to have with us Rich Honan today from Phillips Lytle. Phillips Lytle is a local law firm well known for their business acumen and knowledge. Rich is well known to a lot of us in the startup world and is a great resource, not only just for what he knows, but how genuinely he really wants to help startups in our community and just how down to earth he is. So with his humor and his practical experience, he brings great wealth of information to us today. So, Rich, all yours.
Thanks. Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening in. Yeah, if you have questions on this or anything, just stop me. And if it's something that I hit later, I'll let you know. If not, I'll just answer the question. And it could be on any, legal, corporate, business issue. I'm Rich Honan. I run the venture capital group for Phillips Lytle. I've been doing startup work since late 80s, early 90s. 82 grad of University of Albany, 1982. So if you're talking about a founder's agreement, you can talk about it one of two times. One is when you just, before your company is formed or after, during. Like everything else, best to talk about it earlier. You don't have to have an entity yet. You should be talking about it with the person who you think might be your co-founder, if you have someone. Especially you see a lot in academia, you'll see students, you'll see professors collaborating. Sometimes they're doing sponsored research. Sometimes it's a class and it turns into a project. So you want to talk about it early. You don't have to have an organization yet. For most of us in the entrepreneurial world, we're all kind of goal oriented and not process oriented. So annoyingly, this is something that is a little process oriented. You have to think about it. And I say this everywhere I go, every business relationship is a human relationship. So just think back to high school. And, if you were like me standing at the wall of the gym while a dance or something was going on, and all those feelings, seriously, the same thing. And the most important one, like in every relationship, is, what are the goals of the parties? Is it long-term? Is it short-term? And it usually starts up at the top. Does somebody have another gig? Usually you do, especially if you're doing collaboration, maybe with students and faculty. The faculty's got a job. Students might be a graduate assistant, but they might have a lot more time. That's the first thing. Are you going to give 100% of your time to this? Like everything else, they tell you with relationships, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just having the conversation, but you should know it going in. Is this going to be the only thing you do? What's the term? How long do you think this is going to take? This is really industry specific. If you go over to RPI where they have the gaming major, the gamers, they'll put together an LLC. They'll work on a game for 6 months. They put it on Steam and they're done. They're on to the next thing. So they're not even thinking, long term. Yes, if it makes money, they'd like to get money from it, but it's not even a consideration that this might be a long-term gig. If you're doing, biotech, if you're doing substrates, if you're doing, heavy duty chemistry or mechanics, you understand it's going to be a long-term thing. It's just, is this going to be something that you're going to give 2 years to? Is this something that you're going to try and take all the way to the end? And that's the last point there. For most entrepreneurs, the goal is an exit. Okay, not necessarily an ongoing gig, but there's nothing wrong with that. You could build something. You could license it out. You can make money. You can do all those things. It's just important to sit down at some point and have this conversation with your co-founders. Because things that, of course, I'm putting 100% of my time. This is it. This is my one shot. And the other person might be, well, yeah, I mean, obviously I have a job and I'm not going to, founder on the rocks if this thing doesn't go. So most important thing, talk to the founder. Again, no right or wrong answer, but it would be good if you folks know what's going on from the beginning. So founders agreement, you can see the bullets. Yes, it's a written agreement. A lot of the things that it addresses are things that we often address in other agreements. You've confidentiality, you've all seen NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, right? Everybody understands how those work. If you're going to talk to somebody, the Vegas rule applies, everything you say there stays there. And that's, everybody's pretty familiar with those. A founder's agreement will include confidentiality. You know, we're not going to tell anybody about this. Non-competition, if a founder leaves, can that founder go and start a new company? Well, usually the answer is, well, certainly not with any of our intellectual property. Whether you want to do something else in the industry, it's worth having that conversation. And again, you have to take into account who your founders are. If the founders are students, these are highly, well, hopefully everybody is, but the technology students are really highly employable people. And they might, want to take this knowledge and go work for somebody else. Is that a conflict? You know, that's a conversation to have. The same things you see in an NDA, the same things you might see in a consulting agreement in terms of non-competition or an employment agreement, you're going to see in the founders agreement. Okay. Assignment of IP, of intellectual property, probably, one of the most important things. And yes, I'll get to the licensing issue in a minute, but remember, as you sit here today, unless you do something, your intellectual property is not yet in your company. Even if you have formed a company, and let's say you form a corporation, you own 100% of the stock, you have to do something more to move the stuff from your head into the corporation. Just like when you buy a piece of property, you get a deed, we have an assignment, we call it an assignment. You're assigning, you're giving, you're conveying all of the intellectual property in your head about this issue to the company. Okay, it's important. Yes, you will find entrepreneurs who say, well, I own it, but I'm going to license it to the company. That rarely works. No investor is going to want to invest in something unless they have all the intellectual property wrapped up. But so we make that overt, we put that in the founders agreement. Okay. And it's pretty far reaching. Anything you think about in the past, the present, or the future about within this field of use. Okay. Usually the arm wrestle is what exactly is the field of use? You're not going to say nanotechnology. That's kind of everything. You might say, something more specific, but that's important to have in a founders agreement. That's important not only for the two of you or the three or the five of you, but for investors. And then the last issue is probably the thorniest. Once you have gotten together and decided, and by the way, I say stock here, and which applies to corporations. Same if you have an LLC, same if you have a partnership, anything. It's all the same concept. The first question is, okay, how do you want to whack up the stock? And that's usually a pretty good indication into people's view of their relative worth, right? A lot, people might say, hey, there's three of us, like go back to the gamers. It's always even. So if there's six of them, they each get 1/6. That's just how they roll. But you might be sitting with somebody and say, yeah, I'm ready to divide up the stock. So I was thinking I'd get 90 and you'd get 10. Okay. Now, besides whatever the visceral impact of that is, they have an idea of their contribution that might be different from your idea of their contribution. Okay. And that, to me, that's the most important part of the conversation. Start with that. How do you want to split this up? And then the idea, so that's the first question. And then what happens if you leave? Okay. And that's where we talk about vesting. And I think everybody's probably familiar generally with vesting. It's the idea that if you're given a certain amount of stock in a company, whether you own the company or whether you're an employee, the longer you stay, the more of that stock you own. It's meant to retain people. But in a closely held company, if there's two of us and one of us leaves, then what happens? Okay. All that goes into the founders agreement. I think I already talked about this. It's really important that the company, the entity, is the repository of all the IP. I already said that. It's got to be physically assigned over. There's got to be some legal document that sends it over. And that's got to be That's got to be pretty unconditional, unrestricted. The company now owns it. Tied into that is this third bullet point, which is if you're licensing, if the technology that you're working on is something that you're going to have to license from the school, for example, which is a lot of the technology that you might be working on here, or sometimes you're licensing it from a private company. You're doing some sponsored research or something, and maybe they're paying you to research, but maybe you're going to keep a portion of the intellectual property. Really important here, and I think everywhere, that the school is usually going to want to license, the license goes to the company. Okay, the license agreement is between the school and the company. And that only makes sense if the company has all the IP. Okay, so the license rights are part of the IP that the company owns, in addition to all the thoughts and know-how and everything that's in your head. We already talked about the second point. The competition thing is worth having a conversation about. What does it mean to compete? Certainly the person is not, you're not thinking they're going to hang out a shingle next door and directly compete, but they probably want to be able to get a job in that industry. And especially if you're talking about younger founders, you don't want to be overly restrictive. This is probably the thorniest investing. All right, so what happened? There's two problems. What if somebody leaves, or what if somebody gets thrown out? How do you handle it? If you don't have a founder's agreement and you've done what everybody else does, which is there's three of us, we each get a third of the stock. And then, 2 months later, one of the founders gets a $250,000 annual offer from Google. They're gone. If you don't have anything else, now you have a founder with 1/3 of the stock of the company. Okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be an acrimonious situation, but it's going to be impossible, highly difficult to get any outside investment when you have, the absent founder is like the bane of the existence of venture capitalists. That and the ugly cap table where, you have 27 different, series of stock. This is for my aunt, this is for my grandmother, this is for, whoever. But you need to have a way of bringing that ownership back into the corporation or the LLC or whatever it is. Okay. Easiest way to do that, and there's tax issues here, but let's assume you all started it on the first day. The company had no value on day one, so we don't have any tax issues. Usually what you say is you have to be here X amount of years to fully vest, to have full ownership of whatever portion we've given you. So if you have 33%, maybe that'll vest over 4 years. That's generally how they do it. I actually think 4 years is a long time. I have a hard time projecting out 4 years. To me, I think you can make kind of plans for 2 years, and after that, usually all hell breaks loose. But 4 years is what everybody seems to do. And so let's say you have that. We all have 33%, subject to us all staying here for 4 years. If you leave in 2 years, you'll have 16% or whatever. Usually, when it's friendly, you'll say that everything will accelerate upon an exit. Okay, so everybody's now fully vested. Okay. The issue there is while you, in my example, while the three of you might have that deal, the buyer may not. The buyer may say, hey, we're going to buy the intellectual property, and we're going to give you this amount of money or this amount of, it's usually this amount of stock sometimes in the buyer. They're going to say, but we're buying you. We're buying, what's in your head. And we need you to stay here for another 4 years, maybe, before you get the full benefit of whatever the purchase price is. But the short answer is it usually accelerates upon a change of control. Okay. And the other conversation that you have depends not so much on the relative contribution of the founders, but what are they contributing? The argument or the discussion you often have is somebody says, well, here's the thing, my job was to write the code. Okay, maybe somebody else's job was to make it mobile or something like that, but I wrote the code. it took me 9 months to write the code. Okay, now I'm on 4-year vesting and I've kind of done 90% of everything I was asked to do. So a lot of times, you have to be a little bit kind of custom in your vesting. You got to look at people's relative contributions, because you will have people who, it's their job to do one thing and it's really necessary, but then they're kind of done. Okay. Now that might manifest itself in how much of the company that person owns. Okay, but that's a separate discussion from when have they earned, when have they done what we need them to do to earn it? Okay, so, this is all part of that conversation when everybody's sitting around drinking and, deciding, how they're going to spend the money once you do the IPO. And that's what I meant by what are their contributions. I don't know why we capitalize that. It looks kind of old English, but well, in a legal document, whenever a term is capitalized, that means it's a defined term somewhere. So every time I see it, I look to see if we have a definition. The other thing, to your point, investors will often make you start a new vesting schedule. Okay, so you've been doing this, you've been slogging it out for 2 years, you're finally getting some traction, and now an investor comes in and they're making a sizable investment, everybody's happy. And the investor says, hey, this is great. We'll take 20% of the company for $1 million, implies like a $5 million valuation. Everybody's a millionaire on paper. And they say, and we're fine with our 20%. And the three of you can split up the other 80%. But just like we said before, that vesting schedule is going to start anew because now we have another 4 years of work. Okay. And this is something that usually grinds on entrepreneurs because, they say, what the hell? It was my company. You came to put money in my company. And now I could actually lose equity in the company. The answer is yeah. Because again, they're investing in you. At least that's what they'll tell you. They're investing in you. They need you. The technology without you might not have as much value. Without more, then that you don't necessarily have a basis to divest that person their stock for not contributing. Now, for example, in an LLC, you usually have an operating agreement and it'll actually talk about additional contributions. Okay, so it might very well be, sorry about that. It might very well be, was this a corporation or an LLC in your scenario?
At the time this happened, this was an LLC, yeah.
There might be some, in the 30 pages that nobody ever reads, like the second 30 pages, there might be something there. There often is something that says when you make when we call for contributions, if we do it by the right vote, okay, then you have to make the contribution. If you don't, you can be divested accordingly. In the part where they talk about the members, they'll say, here's the obligation, here are the members. There's usually an appendix that says, Eric owns 25%, Kelly owns 50%, whatever. There is a section on contributions and it'll say like initial capital contributions. And a lot of times that answer might be nobody's putting anything in. And then it'll say additional contributions. Okay. Usually it says the initial contribution is people are just assigning the intellectual property. That's usually the opening contribution for most people. But then it will say additional contributions, and it'll say if the LLC votes to make additional contributions by majority vote or whatever it is, you have X amount of days, and if you don't, then we will rejigger the stock percentages accordingly. I don't have a good answer for that. Now, because you're saying everybody's putting in $5,000, okay? That's $20,000 new dollars. What percentage of the company is that? Is that 50% of the value? If so, if it's 1%, it's probably a significant percentage. Okay. There's usually some valuation formula somewhere in your LLC operating agreement. And if there's not, then what they usually say is it's up to the board of managers to come up with some kind of fair valuation. And that was the last point. The investors really need to make sure that they're very open about it. They want to make it painful for you to leave. You often do because that's the other part of it. 2 years later, let's say somebody just either gets thrown out.
Yeah.
Or decides to leave, okay? There's a lot of different ways to go. You could just say, you've vested into half of your 33% or whatever, so now you have 16%. You know, you forfeit the rest, you keep that 16%. If you've drawn up your documents right, it's pretty locked up. They can't sell it to somebody or something like that, okay? Sometimes the person says, no, like in Eric's example, if people put money in, they say, well, if you guys are going to throw me out, for example, I want to have my money back, okay? And then you might have a valuation formula. And you can really, valuation formulas will take over the entire document, because there's a million different ways of doing it. I usually just punt on it and say if the parties will try and agree on a value, and if not, then we'll go to litigation or arbitration. All right, so how do you do this? Oddly, so we're just saying if you have an LLC, you usually have an operating agreement, a fairly lengthy agreement. It tells how people vote and what the president does, and the board of is it managed by the managers or the members? And it could be it could get pretty long. Usually, we'll put these concepts or portions of these concepts will be somewhere in the operating agreement, like the assignment, for example, the assignment of intellectual property. Like it'll say what was your initial contribution, and the initial contribution was I put in I assigned my intellectual property. So in LLC, and which is another reason sometimes why LLCs will actually be a little more expensive than corporations, because if you start with a corporation, you just form the corporation, okay, and you give out the stock, and there's some opening documents, but you can get through the entire corporate formation process without ever having to contemplate these issues, okay. I'm not recommending it, but you can, okay. Usually in a corporation, then you'll have a separate founders agreement. You can sign the founders agreement before or after. You don't have to, that's what I started this with. You don't have to have it. Look, the law school answer is, well, it's better for everybody to have a nice tight written agreement on day one, and then on day two, now you form the corporation. And first, there might be less stuff that you have to do because you now have an agreement governing it. But what usually happens is, people don't do that. They they sign the founders agreement, and then they never really change any of the corporate documents to be consistent with the founders agreement. And I testified a couple of months ago as an expert witness in a case on what was, in my mind, was a founders agreement. And these two guys signed this agreement like 60 years ago, started the company, made tons of money for 60 years. They both died, and now everybody's fighting. And the founders agreement was pretty clear, but the corporate documents never really picked up what actually were counter to what the founders agreement said, So the answer is, it would be great if you could do it before. I don't get too excited if you haven't done it at the time you started your company. As the company starts to acquire value, I'll probably, knock you on it a little bit and say, try and get that done. But again, the most important thing, I think I'm done. Is that okay? I think that's it. The most important thing is to, I hate sounding like this, having the conversation. It's one of those annoying conversations, at least for people like me. It's a conversation that doesn't always go in a linear way and doesn't have an end point. It's just, we're talking about hopes and dreams and aspirations. But you have to know that a little bit. And if you've had that conversation, then I feel better about you not having the founders agreement, because then you probably will have thought about some other things, and then we can pick those up in the corporate documents. More and more founders over the last, I'll say 10 to 15 years, are treating the founders agreement as a necessity. I used to, 20 years ago, I didn't really get many calls on founders agreements, but now you have serial entrepreneurs, you have people and especially in a place like here in the capital region where there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity. Everybody's heard stories and everybody's talking to their friends. And so I do get a lot more questions about it. It's interesting. I often say, don't involve the lawyer in that discussion just because it's not worth $600 an hour in the initial discussion. I tell people, talk about these things, come back with some bullet points, and I'll see if we can make that into a short document. They should first have the conversation, from the first slide, first have the conversation of how long you want to do this, that kind of stuff. Is this going to be our job? Are we going to go get jobs after school? Or, is this going to, that kind of stuff. Have that conversation. And then figure out what if somebody leaves. And then the other thing is this whole vesting idea. Is there some amount of time we need from each other? Have that conversation, give me some bullet points, then you can sit down with me and usually we'll fill out, fill out some of the things you haven't thought about. And usually people will say, we're having this conversation and I'll give them a couple of things to think about. So do that and then come in. And whatever people want to do, it's easy enough to draft up. And there's lots of stuff online. If you Google founders agreements, and lots of law firms do memos on it and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things. And people will call them pre-incorporation agreements, buy-sell agreements, stockholder agreements, operating agreements, all the same concept. First, you have to become clear in your mind, are you? And they might say, yeah, this woman she's the professor, she's the expert, she's world known, she's the one who got the grant or something like that. And, but you have, like in everything else, you have to go in with the assumption that you have value, or else you kind of wouldn't be there. Now, again, maybe you don't say 90-10, maybe you don't even say 50-50. That's when it is good to talk to people, not necessarily lawyers, but kind of talk to entrepreneurs, talk to friends here and say, well, she did this, and this, but I'm doing this, give me a number. And then if that person says, hey, I think you're worth 5%, then you have to say, really? And maybe it's like, wow, I'm doing all the coding. And, maybe she says anybody could do that, and have that conversation. My first question is, how much relative time are people putting in? Usually the professor is like, no, I kind of got it started and, my reputation, looks good on kind of the company resume, but this individual is going to be taken. She's going to run with it, and then it kind of suggests itself, if at that point the professor still needs 50%, and it's hard as a lawyer, when you're brought into these things, you're kind of for the company, you're not supposed to take sides. But the other reason why they call you is like, Rich, how does this sound to you? So you have to go in having some idea of your value. I really like people to bounce it off of other people, somebody who it might be easier for you to hear that your value and the world's conception of it might not be the same. Yes, and what I usually take the shortcut of saying, here's the founders agreement. It overrides everything we said in every other document. That's one sentence. And, now I like to know what's in the other documents, you know what I mean? Because there's some things by law, it's harder to override. It's usually a few years down the line that happened in my experience.
Yeah.
And so usually by then we might look at each other and say, all right, let's revise the founders agreement. Or we might say by then, you know what? You have this amount of equity. It's pretty much fully vested. You have this amount. You've gotten along with each other for 2.5 years. Now this new person's coming in. Maybe we revise it. Maybe we rip it up. maybe, maybe we tell somebody, we say, all right, this is how it's gonna be. You're gonna have 33%, you're gonna have 40%, whatever. Maybe vesting for the new person, I get that, as well as them assigning their IP. But they get revised a lot, and they're written so that if you bring on a new founder and they're kind of like another one equal, like an equal, you don't have to rewrite the agreement. We write it so that you say, there's a page at the end of the agreement that says it's the three of us and we're 33% each. And now a year later, it's the four of us and we're 25% each. And the only thing that might change is making sure that the first people get the credit for however long the vesting time has been. So the answer is they get changed a lot. Sometimes if the company's mature enough, sometimes you just say, let's just do it this way, with some vesting for the new person.